Good morning to all. On behalf of the Chairman, Professor Dilip Nachne, and the Center for Economic and Social Studies, and on my own behalf, I welcome Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, a distinguished scholar and today's speaker. He is unable to join us in person. He is joining online. And today's chair of this memorial lecture session is Dr. D. Subbarao. I welcome him, and I welcome the founder members of the center. Professor Hanmantarao sir has not joined. He has joined online again. He would be joining, and Professor Mahendra Reddy and board members, Professor Fatima Ali Khan would join soon. I welcome Professor K. Krishna, who is former chairperson, Center for Economic and Social Studies, and I welcome the invitees from IAS and then retired IAS officers and from other academic institutions, Government of Telangana, and some of the invitees have come from intellectual cell of Congress Party and leaders from different political parties also we have invited. They will be joining us. And faculty, staff of Center for Economic and Social Studies and from other institutions. I welcome you all warmly to the 4th annual memorial lecture of Sri B.P.R. Vithal Garu. I request Dr. D. Subbarao to lead the forward review to Professor Sri B.P.R. Vithal Garu. Then we can carry on the other activities. Shuktal has come here and she has joined us for this morning. I request the chair of this memorial session, Dr. D. Subbarao Garu, to come into the dais. Today's speaker, distinguished scholar Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, is currently Distinguished Fellow, Center for Social and Economic Progress at New Delhi. He served as the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of Government of India from 2004 to 2014, a key figure in India's economic reforms from the early 1980s onwards. He has held several important positions, including Special Secretary to the Indian Prime Minister, Commerce Secretary, and Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs, Ministry of Finance, and Finance Secretary, Ministry of Finance. He was also member of the Planning Commission, Government of India, and member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister during 1998-2001. His published works include Reforming the Global Financial Architecture, that is from the Commonwealth Secretariat, London, and State-Level Performance under Economic Reforms in India, published in Economic Policy Reforms and the Indian Economy, edited by Anne Kruger, and Economic Reforms in India since 1991, has gradualism worked from the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 2002, and Infrastructure Development in India's Reforms in India Economic Reforms and Development, Essays for Manmohan Singh. This is edited by Aisha Judge Ahluwalia and IMD Little. And also India's Economic Reforms and Appraisal in India in the Era of Economic Reforms, edited by Jeffrey Sachs and Neil Bajpai. We are very much honored to have this morning Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia as our speaker, who will be giving away his fourth B.P.R. Vithal Memorial Lecture on Challenges of Policy Making in a Fast-Changing World. Thank you, sir, for accepting to be with us this morning. I welcome Dr. Duburi Subbarao Garu, who is chairing this session, who is former governor of the Reserve Bank of India and is a distinguished economist who led the RBI during a period of global financial turbulence. A 1972 IAS topper, he served as Finance Secretary to the Government of India and Secretary to the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. He also worked as lead economist at the World Bank. An alumnus of IIT Kharagpur, IIT Kanpur, Ohio State University, he was a Humphrey Fellow at MIT and earned his doctorate from Andhra University. His book, Who Moved My Interest Rate, explains policy dilemmas and challenges facing an emerging economy in a globalized world. Dr. Subbarao is currently guest faculty at Yale University. He has given the third B.P.R. Vithal Memorial Lecture last year, and we are happy that he has agreed to chair this fourth memorial lecture today. Sri B.P.R. Vithal, it's for the brevity of the students and also outsiders that B.P.R. Vithal is the founder, Center for Economic and Social Studies. And we all should know about his profile and his contributions for setting up of this institute. He was the son of Professor B.V. Ramanarsu, Principal, Warangal Arts and Science College, and Professor of Economics. Born in Rajahmundry on 30th November 1927, Vithal was educated at Madrasa-e-Aliyah High School, Hyderabad. In 1942, he quit his undergraduate studies at Nizam College, attended the Quit India session of the Indian National Congress in Mumbai, and immersed himself in the national movement. On Gandhiji's advice, he returned to his studies at Madras. He was the first Indian president of Madras Christian College Students' Union to fly the Indian tricolor flag. He graduated from the Madras Christian College with BSc in chemistry. He joined in Hyderabad Public Service Commission in 1949 and qualified for the IAS in 1950. In one of his early postings as principal, Community Development College at Rajendra Nagar, P.V. Narasimha Rao was his student. Later, he served as a deputy collector at Banswara, Nizamabad district, and collector of Medak and Karimnagar districts. In 1960, Vithal was appointed as registrar of Osmania University. During his period, he built the Department of Economics at Arts College by inviting stalwarts like Professor Gautam Mathur, Professor Raja Jechalaya, and Professor N.S. Iyengar. B.P.R. Vithal served the Planning and Finance Departments, Government of Andhra Pradesh, for a continuous period of 13 years during 1969 to 1982, as secretary and principal secretary. He was deputy chairman, Andhra Pradesh State Planning Board, and member Tenant Finance Commission. He was also chairman, Expenditure Commission, Government of Kerala. He had a brief stint at the International Monetary Fund as fiscal advisor to the governments of Sudan and Malawi. He was a member of the Ken Raj Committee on Taxation of Agricultural Income, Government of India. Vithal Garu founded the Center for Economic and Social Studies. With the underlying thinking at that time with which the institute was founded was that social science research was concentrated in Delhi and revolved around macroeconomic issues. It was felt that research around social sciences need to be decentralized and closer to the ground realities. At the same time, research institutes were set up in other states of Tamil Nadu. Malcolm Adiseshiya set up MIDS in 1971-72, and in Kerala, Ken Raj set up the Center for Development Studies, and Karnataka, B.P.R. Rao set up ISEC in 1972. By then, the planning department was involved in preparation of development plans on a regional basis as the Telangana issue acquired importance after 1969. VLS Prakash Rao, Manzoor Alam, Afzal Mahmood, and Dr. Y. Venugopal Reddy were working on regional planning. But insisting a full-time state planning board was not appropriate, he thought, as it would be under the control of state government. Vithal sir was keen that the institution, that is CESS, should be an autonomous institution, fully funded by the government, working for the state government as a think tank, contributing to policy making of the state, similar to that of the Planning Commission working for Government of India. He has taken initiative to set up the CESS along with other founder members, Dr. G. Ram Reddy, Vice Chancellor Usmania University, Dr. S.K. Rao, DG NIRD, Professor C.H. Hanmantarao, and Dr. Wahiduddin Khan, who became the first director of the center later in 1982. The center was formally established on 26 February 1980. He was the first chairman of the center. Thus, he positioned CESS as an autonomous institution, which was later brought into the national network of ICSR, becoming a national institution, providing a platform between academicians and policymakers. He built the institution brick by brick by choosing suitable and eminent persons. He was instrumental in getting land allotted for the center in its present site. He always used to say when land was allotted in Usmania University, he did not prefer that, and he preferred land away from the university so that research can take place in a focused way. The necessary permissions and grants were easy to flow with him at the helm of affairs. B.P.R. Vithal has many publications to his credit, prominent among them which are Estate in Periodic Crisis, Andhra Pradesh, in Retrospect MSLNE, Gargill Formula for Allocation of Central Assistance for State Plans, Fiscal Federalism in India. His research paper titled The Telangana Surpluses, a Case Study, played an influential role in shaping the demand for a separate state of Telangana. Vithal sir was always interacting with faculty on the areas of their work. He used to send small, brief notes reflecting his own experiences when he was working in the districts as in Nizamabad and other districts, and the thoughts which were helpful to know the historical context of the issue. He was known for his wit, and his presence in the meetings would make it much livelier and more interesting. CESS fraternity remembers Sri B.P.R. Vithal Garu, the Pitamaha of Center for Economic and Social Studies, in reverence for his contribution in setting up this institute and making it known nationally and internationally. In memory of Sri B.P.R. Vithal, annual lectures have been instituted by the Board of Governors. The auditorium has been named after him. The first memorial lecture was delivered by Dr. C. Rangarajan in March 2022 on India's recent growth experience, who was also former Governor RBI and former Chairman Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. The second lecture was delivered by Dr. Vijay Kelkar on Towards Strengthening India's Cooperative Federalism, Initiatives for Multi-Level Governance Reforms in December 2023. The third lecture was delivered by Dr. D. Supparao, again former Governor RBI and a scholar in public finance on India's fiscal federalism, Quo Vadis. That was in January 2025. The fourth lecture is now being delivered by Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia on challenges of policy making in a fast-changing world. It is most appropriate that Dr. Subbarao Garu is chairing this lecture. And now I request him to conduct the memorial lecture. Thank you.
On my own behalf, welcome to this fourth B.P.R. Vithal Memorial Lecture. I had the privilege of giving this lecture last year. I'm having the double privilege of chairing this year's lecture session, especially when it's being delivered by a public intellectual like Montek Singh Ahluwalia. First, a few words on my own behalf about Sri B.P.R. Vithal. When he passed away, in his obituary I wrote of him, I described him as an intellectual bureaucrat. Most people would think that's odd. An intellectual bureaucrat is an oxymoron. How can a bureaucrat be intellectual, and why would an intellectual become a bureaucrat? But Sri Vithal defied that stereotype. He had enormous scholarship, spanning several disciplines: economics, political science, philosophy, theology, history, literature. And he had the wisdom to blend all that into a worldview that made him an outstanding civil servant. As we all know, he had a distinguished career in the IAS. He was finance secretary of the combined state of Andhra Pradesh for over 10 years, worked under 7 chief ministers, and gained the confidence and respect of each and every one of them. There's a story that goes around that there was a meeting with Chennaredi, chief minister, and there were about 7 or 8 secretaries and 3 or 4 ministers. Sri Vithal gave some advice, and one of the ministers started criticizing those comments. Then Chennaredi, not the best known role model for respecting civil servants, he actually said, he told the minister, instead of he chastised the minister, saying you must listen to wisdom when it comes. So that's Sri Vithal. He served in the 10th Finance Commission. We all know that the Finance Commission has a very enviable job of balancing the demands of states, vociferous, high decibel, strident demands of states for more resources, and the plea of the center that there must be enough money left for the center for defense, for national security, etc. That was also a time, you might recall, when we had stalwart chief ministers, especially here in South India, where Ramakrishna Hegde in Karnataka, Jayalalitha in Tamil Nadu, and here in Andhra Pradesh, larger-than-life NTR. What was common to all of them was that they came to office on an anti-center platform. In fact, NTR, we all remember, famously said the center is a conceptual myth, saying that if you look at a map of India, all you see is states. So he said, why does the center require any money at all? So that was a time when Mr. Vithal served in the Finance Commission, when the wind was blowing very strongly towards the states. I was Finance Secretary here at that time, and I was secretly hoping that Mr. Vithal would be biased towards states because he knew state finances. But I was proved wrong. He had the ability, wisdom, to combine his appreciation of the needs of states with this nationalistic view that India cannot have strong states without a strong center. Now, a little bit about Sri Montek Singh Ahluwalia. It's very fitting that this memorial lecture is being delivered by him, who, like Sri Vithal did, combines administrative brilliance with sharp wit and a refreshing ability to puncture pomposity. Over 3 decades, Sri Ahluwalia has earned a formidable reputation for steering India's economic policy, first as Finance Secretary, then as Deputy Chairman of Planning Commission, and over the last 10 years as a public intellectual. He is undoubtedly India's reforms man, India's best-known economist, and the best-known Indian economist outside India. I've had the privilege of working with Montek in several capacities. When he came in as Finance Secretary in the early 90s, I was a mid-level official in the Ministry of Finance. You remember that was the Blitzkrieg reforms of 1991. I was peripheral to the core reform team, but all of us working in North Block could feel the electrifying atmosphere of those momentous reforms of 1991, which were being led by Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, but implemented by Sri Ahluwalia. had also association with him as I became secretary to the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, then as Finance Secretary, and then as Governor. I'm very grateful to him for the advice and support and counsel he gave me during the global financial crisis. In fact, his advice and counsel have benefited many times. I want to give you one example of Montek's administrative insights. When I was there I told you in mid-1991, there was an IMF team coming, and there was a meeting of joint secretaries which he chaired. And one of the joint secretaries told him, he was the finance secretary, he said, "Sir, you must take a meeting of all government departments to brief them on the IMF mission and what the government must tell the IMF mission. What we should tell them, that we must all say the same thing, speak from the same hymn book." Montek said, "I'll do no such thing. I will let the IMF meet everybody. The IMF knows that different departments, different ministries in the government have different views. For example, on fertilizer subsidy, a big issue at that time, the Department of Fertilizer had a different issue from the Ministry of Finance, and the IMF knew that. He said, I'm not going to brush that up. I'm going to let the IMF be exposed to different views in the government, which I thought was very insightful. Of course, he and I had our own policy differences. Just one or two examples. He suggested that grants being given by the central government to states, which are being utilized by the states for capital building, should be classified as capital grants, because that will then reduce the revenue deficit of the center. Absolutely correct. From an accounting point of view, perfect. But then we in the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council argued that as much as the center's revenue deficit would come down, it would increase the revenue deficit of the states by an equal amount. And what matters is the combined revenue deficit of the center and states. And again, another illustration, very famously, Montek said that the Reserve Bank is sitting on huge foreign exchange reserves. They must be given to our private parties for building infrastructure, because now they're borrowing abroad at very high rates of interest. As finance secretary and as governor, I was not inclined towards that view, because I believed that our reserves were a strength only as long as they were unencumbered. I'm giving this illustration just to let you know that there are policy differences within the government, and these are par for the course. Mr. B.P.R. Vithal once told me, when reforms were being criticized by the left parties, by JNU economists, he once told me, the JNU economists and left economists must learn from Montek how to address criticism without being disagreeable, without being judgmental, respond to them professionally. So that's Montek Singh Ahluwalia. It's disappointing that he's unable to travel to Hyderabad. We all understand that he's unable because of some problems. But I want to say that he has an association with this charming and beautiful city. He spent some of his childhood years in Secunderabad. The topic for today, policy challenges in a fast-changing world. If Mr. B.P.R. Vithal had been here, he would have been chuckling. Because you just said, when was it that world was not changing fast? Since the beginning of time, every period of time, people in real time would have thought that that was very fast changing. So world has always been fast changing, but what's important is to respond with appropriate policies to those challenges, to those changes, which is the topic for today. Today's fast changes, of course, are familiar. There's deglobalization, crumbling of the multilateral system that we've taken for granted. There's technology and artificial intelligence whose implications we don't fully understand. There's demographic transitions, different demographic transitions in different parts of the world. There's climate change. There is uncertain geopolitics. So how do we respond in our country to these fast-changing developments? we couldn't have thought of anyone better than Montek Singh Ahluwalia to address these issues. The last thing I want to say, Montek Singh Ahluwalia has unarguably been the most competent, most celebrated Finance Secretary of India. Shri B.P.R. Vithal arguably has been the best Finance Secretary India did not have. So who better than Montek Singh Ahluwalia to give the B.P.R. Vithal Memorial Lecture today? So I invite Mr. Ahluwalia to deliver the fourth B.P.R. Vithal Memorial Lecture on policy challenges in a fast-changing world. Thank you.
First, good morning, everybody. And I must first of all begin with a very sincere apology. You know, as Subha has just said, I have a lot of affection for Hyderabad because, as he put it, I spent a lot of my childhood in the associated Sikandrabad, which probably you guys regarded as a suburb. But for us, I mean, we were part of Hyderabad, and that's where we went when our parents took us to, for a great treat, to walk along Hussain Sagar. So I would have really loved to be there, but, you know, unfortunately, some kind of a nervous affliction has actually made it very difficult for me to stand. And my doctor tells me that the medication he's given is going to take care of it. And I sincerely hope he's right. But right now, I'm best characterized by the description that he doesn't have the nerves to stand up. So that's uh, I hope you'll accept that I would very much like to have been there. Most of all, also because although I didn't have the privilege of much interaction with Mr. Vittal, he was, as Subha very nicely put it, the best finance secretary India never had. And I think he was one. I mean, I knew of his importance and achievements, and what struck me most was that he was possibly the only one in the IAS to have achieved that stature and decided not to go to Delhi. I mean, that was a very early indication of the fact that growth actually takes place in the states. And indeed, in those days, the main thing Delhi was doing was preventing growth from happening as fast as it could otherwise have. So, a great pity that I never met him. But I have to say that, you know, my late wife, Isha, actually made me much more familiar with his work because she was interested in what was going on in states in subjects like urban infrastructure development, where the center has nothing to do other than to produce slogans. It all happens or doesn't happen at the state level. And she spent a lot of time going around the states. And in that context, she had met Mr. Vittal. And she told me that, you know, if we had more people like him in the different state governments, and not just governments, but in the associations around government, we would actually take off much faster. So, I mean, it's really a privilege to deliver this lecture, which has been delivered by many, many distinguished people, most of all my colleague Subha, who preceded me in this course. And I must thank him for the very, very kind words that he said about me. You know, I particularly enjoy the references to our disagreements because I think the fun of being in government is to realize that the answers are not obvious and a problem is not interesting if knowledgeable people cannot tell you that it's complex and therefore you have to make choices. I disagree with those who believe. I mean, many people used to tell me that, sir, your planning is very good. And they were referring to all my predecessors and me. Your planning is very good, but its implementation that's bad. That I think is not the correct description. Planning, which is good but is not implementable, is actually planning that hasn't taken care of the multiple interests that have to be reconciled. And you have to combine that also with the recognition that it's impossible to reconcile all interests in advance. I mean, the truth of the matter is that making economic policy requires you to recognize that it's complex, create an environment where different people who have different views are being heard, not to come up with a solution right at the beginning, or if you come up with a solution right at the beginning, say that you're very aware that there are problems and you're quite happy to remodel the solution having heard people, but also recognize that when you do that, you can't take care of everybody. But I think just the recognition that there are different views and different possibilities, that's what we need right now, because the world is changing. Now, as Subha rightly pointed out, the world has always changed. But I think what we are seeing in the next 3 or 4 years are changes which are significantly different from what we've been used to. Many people, recognizing these challenges, frequently tell me, "Oh, we need another 1991 moment," and they're thinking of the Narasimha Rao Manmohan Singh reforms. That's no doubt about it that that set of reforms, and I'm glad to be able to say in a Hyderabad meeting, even if I'm saying it remotely from Delhi, that Narasimha Rao politically led the change. I mean, he has Manmohan Singh himself on many occasions said that without the backing of Mr. Narasimha Rao, nothing would have happened. Of course, the many, yes, I think we should use this opportunity to acknowledge and applaud that there's a huge, I recall being in a meeting once when ex-Prime Minister Narasimha Rao in Delhi was asked by someone that, people are always wondering, I mean, between you and Manmohan Singh, I mean, how do you distribute the credit for reforms? And I think Narasimha Rao said something very charming. I mean, he said, well, look, the thing is that by himself, a finance minister is zero. But if you put the prime minister next to him, he becomes a 10. So I thought that was a visual characterization that would make ordinary people recognize that without political backing of different kinds, but a backing has to be tailored to the political circumstances, reforms can't be done. So somehow you need these, and I mean the country owes a debt of gratitude that he chose to provide backing for a political change, an economic change, which Mr. Manmohan Singh actually masterminded, but which actually overturned 30 years of thinking. My great regret is that they didn't actually say that we're overturning it, because I think it would have been much easier for subsequent generations. In those days, the political compulsion was continuity, because after all, they were overchanging policies that had been put in place by earlier Congress governments. So the whole focus was, no, we're not really doing all that much. We've made changes in the past. This is a continuation of the same thing. It wasn't a continuation of the same thing. It was a radical change. And I think this becomes relevant when people say we need another 1991 reform moment. That time, the change that was needed was very clear. We were one of three countries that hadn't integrated with the rest of the world. We were unnecessarily closed, and the world was extremely supportive. I mean, the 1990 was actually, in a way, the high point of globalization. So it was a no-brainer that all we had to do was get rid of some of our restrictions. But I think today that's not the case. I mean, I think we have a double challenge today. One is the challenge: what are the domestic constraints that now hold up our growth? And the second is, how do we marry these changes to a world which is also changed? On the domestic side, let me just say that the issue is simply that the economy, thanks to the reform processes of the last 20 years, has demonstrated the ability to sort of grow at 6.5%. Now, every time you open the newspaper these days, I mean, I appreciate that journalists have to talk about new things. So you get too much focus on little, the last quarter's growth rate or something or the other. I'm making an assertion that when all is said and done, the growth rate today is 6.5%, if you like, more or less sustainable. Second, that this is good. India is the fastest growing emerging market country today, mainly because China has reached the limit of growth and will now slow down. I mean, it's virtually at the level of what is classified as a developed country. So we have not got to what China did, but we're doing better in terms of growth than China did. So we are the fastest growing, although we still one-fourth of the per capita income of China. Uh, but the difference is that we cannot assume that this 1991 growth rate will, this 6.5% growth rate will continue. And the reason we can't assume that is that basically the world is now different. No, what is it now that makes the world different, which we have to adjust to? Domestically, as I've said, 6.5, our domestic objectives have also been laid out. For example, in the Viksit Bharat objective, which I think is very sensible, that by 2047, let us in effect hope to get to where China is today, or maybe a little better. That, let's be clear, that requires a real growth rate of 8% or so. So the name of the game is how do we get from 6.5 to 8%? Even if the world wasn't changing, this transition would require a huge government effort. And one set of both research and policy work, etc., focuses on those changes. But to design policy, we also have to recognize that those changes may not be exactly what we thought were necessary 4 or 5 years ago because the world has changed. And what is it that has changed? So I would look at just many things have changed, but let me just look at three. One is geopolitics has changed dramatically. I don't want to go into the reasons for it, but it's totally clear that we had a long period of acceptance of globalization, sort of a generalized environment of integration, because that world was presided over by what you could call a benign hegemon, the United States. Benign if you didn't happen to be in the Middle East or in Latin America. So the United States was not necessarily benign when it saw its own interests deeply involved, but largely for the global economy, it was benign. That world has now changed because the US doesn't seem to think that that world works for it, and it has been willing to dismantle it. It's not just Mr. Trump today, it's been happening a little bit over time, but in his case, he's made it a much more dramatic change. And we need to work out what our policies should be in the light of that. And it impacts us in two ways. It impacts us on security, because the other global superpower that's coming up is China, behind the United States, but now challenging it. And it's not a power that we have at the moment a very happy relationship with. So it has some, we cannot make the assumption that, that on the security side, everything is fine. So that's one challenge. That's one aspect. The other aspect is that global trade is no longer exactly what it was before. And this raises totally new challenges. For example, do we go as far as the current, let's say, superpowers are doing, which seem to be withdraw from local supply chains and try to go as Atmanirbhar as possible and relocate everything at home? Or do we I take more selective approach, which is to identify certain areas where we really do have to build a domestic capability, but don't let that be used by, let's say, every domestic industry to claim that it needs a completely protective shield against everything. That's going to be a very tough call to make. The other area which is relevant in terms of change is climate change. Now, climate change, the talks have been going on for a long time. And the global awareness of climate change goes back to 1992, the Rio conference. And, during right up to maybe something like 2021, when the Glasgow meeting took place, it looked as if the global community was moving towards a consensus. I mean, it should be said to the credit of developing countries, and India too, led by different prime ministers, that we slowly move to a recognition that, listen, we are much below the other countries, and we have not benefited from the period when they could actually happily pollute the world. But there's now a carbon budget, so we have to take on some responsibility. At the same time, the global consensus was that developing countries must be assisted to do so. That consensus actually vanished. I mean, the COP30 we just ended in Brazil is very clear that on the financial side, very little is actually being concretely offered. And the United States has actually walked out of the global fight. So I won't go into that. But from our point of view, let's be very clear about it. Climate change is a huge problem. We are seeing the effects of it in many ways. And it's not just that temperature is rising. Basically, monsoon patterns are changing. Concentration of rainfall, even if the average precipitation is the same, concentration of rainfall in certain areas is increasing. And as a result of that, you get much more water in a much shorter time, which runs off and goes to the sea. And frankly, this will undermine very greatly our own agricultural capacity unless we do something to make sure that with the new rainfall patterns, water availability, water is conserved, groundwater is not depleted, which means really reversing a lot of policies that we mindlessly followed earlier, and so on. And my last area, really, that we have to talk about is technology. Now, again, I mean, technology has been changing all the time. But the difference, I think, is that the pace of change of technology is actually greatly accelerated. The usual way that people explain this is that, when the automobile came, I mean, it took about 2 decades to reach 100 million people. And when the telephone phone came, it took about 10 years. And when the internet came, it took about 3 years. And when ChatGPT came, it took about 3 days. So and these are foundational changes. They are not little changes. So the question really is that earlier technology change gave people a lot of time to adjust. Today, that is not the case. So people saying, oh, well, when technology has changed in the past, it has been to the benefit of everybody, and things have managed, new jobs have been created, etc., to replace the jobs destroyed. I think today we're in a situation where a much larger proportion of existing jobs, particularly in the modern sector, may get disrupted very quickly. And the pace of creation of new jobs will be much slower and will depend upon how we do other things which would enable us to benefit from a very changed world in terms of trade. Now, I think these are the dimensions in which we have to focus. But, in all of these dimensions, one thing is very critical, and that is that solutions that people propose almost always involve a lot of effort, which says that we need to develop a technology just the way China has done, and then they forget that China did it over a 20-year period and spent a huge amount of money. So many of the efforts, for example, to have our own, to be Atmanirbhar in electronics, cost a lot of money. Some of this money, I think, is really necessary, and that's something we have to recognize. But, solving our defense problem, which I mentioned earlier, is going to require more expenditure. The biggest shortfall in our present developmental strategy is that we haven't done a good enough job in both education and health. And overcoming these problems will require government expenditure. And most of this expenditure will be in state levels because health and education are essentially state subjects. And also the investment required in conserving more water is also have to be done in the state sector. So how do we help states to actually do this? As far as industry modernization is concerned, there one can argue that that's really something that the central government has to do. But if you add up all these things, if you talk to people, they frequently say defense expenditure is now less than 2%. It should be at least some say half and some say 1% higher within 5 years. Similarly, on education, people say another 1%. Health, another 1%. Technology, Indian R&D is far lower than other countries that have done well. And not just government. Government is lower, but government is not doing so badly. the private sector's investment in R&D is very, very low indeed. So that requires an increase in government expenditure to incentivize private R&D. Plus, in agriculture, if you're going to bring, if you like, climate-resistant varieties to the market, we have to greatly strengthen our agricultural research efforts, and that also will require more expenditure. So people would say 1% over there. Now, if you add up all these various percentages, it is very easy to come to the conclusion that the transition that is required in different areas requires an increase in government expenditure of center and states put together, at least 5 percentage points of GDP. Now, this has to be factored into, if you like, the fiscal corrective. And that is that the objective circumstances today are such that India's fiscal deficit is much higher than most other developing countries. Now, we do have one advantage, and that is that our growth rate is also higher, but it's not that much higher that we can avoid the problem of controlling the fiscal deficit. I would say that the government has done a good job, the present government has done a good job in containing the fiscal deficit and slightly bringing it down. But as of now, we are not actually committed to a pace of reduction of the fiscal deficit. I think the last time the finance minister spoke, she said that the idea is we will reduce the fiscal deficit so that the debt to GDP ratio declines gradually. But she didn't indicate a target that she wanted to reach. But if the fiscal deficit is to decline, and let's say you take a modest assumption, it's going to be very difficult for the state fiscal deficits to decline. So the bulk of the burden of reducing the fiscal deficit have to be borne by the center. If you think that, let's say, 4.9% of GDP fiscal deficit is too high for the center, and it should be brought down to, let us say, 3%, that's a reduction in the fiscal deficit of 1.9%. Now, combining that with the need to increase expenditure by 5% of GDP and the need to reduce the deficit by 1.9% of the GDP, you're really talking about a fiscal turnaround of something of the order of 7%. And if this is to be achieved over the next 5 years or so, it will require a massive effort. And that massive effort has to be either we raise more revenue because we either revamp our taxation system, bring in new methods of taxation, new bases for taxation, something like that, or a big reduction in expenditure. You get rid of some kind of expenditures that are not actually very effective, so you restructure the expenditure side. Now, this is always talked about, but there's very little actual action for the last 20 years in getting rid of things. Maybe on subsidies, the most important thing has been we have been able to get rid of very high subsidies on petroleum, domestic supply of petroleum. That subsidy has gone down, but that has gone down mainly because the global oil price has also gone down. And maybe with climate change, it'll go down further as people get out of oil. But, how are we going to achieve this is part of the challenge before. Now, my main point in raising all this is that too much of our discussion today tends to be listing of action in individual areas. And I think that action is also contestable. For example, what should be the trade policy that we follow, given what is happening in world trade? One approach, as I mentioned earlier, is that everybody is raising protective walls, and we should also raise protective walls. The other is that we are still not aligned with large parts of the world, which are actually quite willing to trade much more freely. It's only the United States that is weaponizing tariffs and is actually speaking a different language. Europe is not doing that. Asia is not doing that. They may come around to doing a little bit of it, but to my mind, the most important thing for us is to establish credibility that we are willing to join the rest of the world in all countries that actually have a reasonably open trade regime. And that's why I think the FTA we've signed with the UK is a very good idea. I hope we end up signing an FTA with the EU. Everybody talks that it's almost done, but let's hope it gets done. I think we also need to think about Asia. I mean, let's face it, we cannot simply say that we're willing to sign FTAs with the UK, we're willing to sign FTAs with the EU, and hopefully we'll sign something with the USA from an image that is entirely Western oriented, and see whether we can sign trade agreements with Asia. Now, the obvious thing was RCEP. We obviously at one time thought we were going to do it. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't have sent a delegation led by the Prime Minister in 2019 to Bangkok to sign. But at the last minute, we decided not to sign and stayed up. I don't know what the lobbying was behind that. It could be that some sections of industry were not happy. Many people in CII, for example, say that they were recommending that we should sign it, but different industries have different interest groups, and governments have to take care of them all. Well, I would say that the main reason for resistance in RCEP was the fear that China is part of RCEP and we are not willing to give China duty-free entry. By the way, I mean, I think there's a separate issue that what should be our trade policy vis-a-vis China, but I can see that the idea of giving China duty-free entry was resisted. But I think the obvious solution to that is that we should apply to join the CPTPP. That is something which is currently headed by Japan. It includes Korea. It includes some of these East Asian countries and some countries outside, including the UK. I think has joined it. So it's a new trade area to which India is entitled in the sense we're eligible, and they are not happy with letting in countries that they don't see as democratic. So the chances are that CPTPP will not take in China, although China has actually applied to join. In my view, we should quite clearly join CPTPP. So that's a trade policy aspect which we need to consider. I think on trade, furthermore, I think we need to recognize that for the majority of air items, we need low duties. To some extent, having signed FTAs, we have come to that conclusion anyway. But I think let's generalize it and let's superimpose on that some concerns which say that, look, we need to develop a capacity in certain areas, and for that we need active support of government. I would say, for example, certainly in the semiconductor area, which is linked to security. I mean, there's a difference between, an import dependency which gives the other country an active scope for weaponization, and a linkage which allows other countries to, if you like, permeate your own security area. For example, if you're using chips which are controllable from outside in systems which are critical to your security. I mean, for example, the electricity grid, the banking system, the telecom system, aircraft movement, etc. You are subjecting yourself to too much risk. But if you're dependent on supplies which go into certain areas, as long as there are enough other sources of such supplies, you're not really all that dependent. So we need to be selective. The danger today is that using the need for security independence, every industry will want a PLI scheme. And I have no objection to PLI. I do object to tariffs because tariffs raise costs to users. And so what happens is that in the interest of the industry that wants that protection, you grant it and you think it's costless, but you make the industry that uses that uncompetitive, which damages everything else. When you give a subsidy, that doesn't happen. The problem with the subsidy is that you have to be watchful how much subsidy you're giving, in the sense that there are two criteria that you have to meet. Number one is, of course, the fiscal constraint. Now, if the amount of subsidy is small, you can fit it into the whole budget, doesn't matter. The other is that if the amount of subsidy is large, there will be demands that the manner in which it is given should be transparent. And here we face another problem. One problem is that the East Asian countries succeeded by being able to choose companies that they thought had credibility and would be capable of making the country a leader. This creates a problem in India because invariably the approach is you shouldn't be favoring big guys over little guys. Now, if you're a completely new industry, and if you look around, it makes sense that you don't simply decide one. But the criteria for eligibility almost invariably will limit the eligible companies that are credible to a small number. And how you design that criterion becomes really quite crucial. So I think these are the areas where it's very easy to imagine that in pursuit of the objective of a globally competitive Viksit Bharat, etc., there are many problems we need to resolve, which are actually, in one sense, unconnected with each other, but which interlink. And the way they interlink is really through the fiscal system. It's difficult to believe that we can meet the constraints of getting from 6.5% to 8% without a much greater fiscal commitment on the part of the central government. And this is including areas like health and education and uncompleted infrastructure, etc. One of the issues the central government needs to think about is that if these constraints are so severe, then why are we being so hesitant about privatization? And many of the things that we are talking about are being done by letting in new private enterprises into the system. There doesn't seem to be any objection to that, which is good. But there doesn't seem to be any willingness to privatize existing public sector entities, which would actually effectively monetize these assets and enable us to invest in new industries. I mean, for example, in my view, all the hotels owned by ITDC should be up for sale. And the purpose of that should be to stimulate new industries. The idea that we are going to let the private sector operate freely and allow the public sector, which exists in these areas, to continue in a very impaired fashion doesn't really make much sense given the fiscal constraints that we have. So, this is why, in my view, there are challenges. I'm very conscious that I'm not providing a list of reforms. I mean, one could do it that way. One could say, this is what we need to do in the banking sector, this is what we need to do in employment, this is what we need to do in labor policy, etc. But I fear that what is happening now is that that approach seems to assume that there is consensus on what will work in each area. There's a lot of hard work to be done. We need to narrow down this huge list. Everybody can give a list of 200. You need to narrow down this list that for the next 5 years, this is what we've got to do, and try to build a consensus around it. Let me give one very simple example, which is related to climate change, and I think which is, to my mind, one of the most urgent. And it's an area where we are doing well. If we want to continue to decarbonize the economy, and let me say, India has no option. We are now about to become, we are the fourth largest economy or something like that, and we are the third largest polluter. The idea that internationally, we will not be under pressure, that people will not expect us to bend the emissions curve is not credible. I think a colleague of mine, Utkarsh Patel, and I are just about to hopefully publish a couple of articles in the Indian Express, which brings out all this in detail. So I will just pick out one point. I think there's general agreement, both in the public and the government and industry, that we need to encourage private sector investment in new and renewable energy. That basically means solar and wind. I think we've done a reasonably good job in that area because there's been a great expansion of capacity. I mean, nothing like the scale of China, but if you keep China out, the scale of expansion in this area looks not bad compared to other countries. Second, this has happened through the private sector. This has not happened because the public sector did it. The public sector is also involved, but it's the private sector that took the lead, and they've done a reasonably good job. Now, when you look at our own objective of decarbonization, somewhere around 2040 or so, you need to have a massive expansion in solar and wind compared to the total, and that will lead to a massive expansion in the share of electricity supplied by renewables. Presently, renewables supply approximately 13+% of total electricity. In the next 10 to 15 years, this may have to go up to 40-45% of total electricity. Now remember, renewables are intermittent in the sense that they do not provide a steady supply. Solar is only there when the sun is shining. So the the intra-day variation in supply from renewables is significant. In order to balance this off, you need certain storage technologies, whether it is pump storage or batteries. So you add those to the cost of production, which makes the cost of renewables that much higher. But that's still not bad compared to the cost of conventional sources, and particularly when you count the pollution which the conventional sources provide, including, by the way, air pollution, which is not a global externality, but a very serious problem in India. I mean, look, something like 14 of the 20 most polluted cities in the world are Indian. If we are thinking of modernizing, if we want people to come to India as investments, etc., I mean, nothing nowadays discourages people more than the fact that the city is the most polluted in the world. I mean, we want to attract Indian scientists who are doing so well abroad to come back. If they're going to relocate their families and their children, I think it's understandable that they are told that, look, you get a reasonable income, but not the same that you're earning there. But if they're told that you also have to accept pollution levels, which are 10 times the level permitted by WHO, they just won't come. In fact, it'll be difficult enough to persuade such people to come for conferences. But the idea of relocation is going to be very difficult. So I think we have to make the transition to renewables. But here's the crux. When you get variable supply, you normally have to adjust through batteries. That will give it less variability. But you also need to adjust consumption patterns. And to adjust consumption patterns, you need to vary tariffs by time of day metering within the day. Secondly, on the wholesale market also, you need flexibility. That is when people ought to move away from the what you might call fixed PPA model, where you contract to get electricity at a fixed price from a particular producer. You do some of that. Most of the electricity will be bought from electricity exchanges. And that means that the producer price will vary. And clearly, you need that in the sense that producers have to recognize that the price of electricity in the exchange market will be low in the period when solar electricity peaks, and it will be higher in the period when it tails off. That will encourage people to set up battery capacity to store the solar in peak periods and use it in subsequent periods. I think this requires a virtually complete change in the way our regulatory system works. And the interesting thing is, it requires a complete change at the state level. I mean, technically, if what I'm saying makes sense, technically, we have 27 states and that many state electricity distribution systems. It's quite possible that the more dynamic states, the states that are technologically more advanced, the states that are benefiting from all this kind of stuff, FDI and that sort of thing, they're the ones that can adjust fastest. So you may have a situation where some states move faster than others. And I think we need to move away from a system where the central government puts limits on what states can do. In my view, uh, we ought to encourage states, and I think Mr. Vithal would certainly have supported this. We ought to encourage states that want to experiment with more flexible pricing systems to be allowed to do that beyond the norms specified in the center. Now, remember that for a state to do this, they have to take on the political task of persuading the consumer that you got to be ready with the variable tariffs. Immediately, the argument will be raised that what about the poor? Well, the solution to that is that you give the poor a direct grant, whatever you think is appropriate, but don't muck up the price system. That's a completely different way of approaching things than what we've been doing. Now, fortunately, the digital connectivity that we've achieved through the India stack enables us to do that. I mean, if we can identify the poor, it's possible to make a straight transfer of what you think is a reasonable subsidy per month and let them then use electricity with a variable on the basis of a variable tariff. That's a huge political change. And frankly, to wait for the whole country to be ready for it would be a huge mistake because we're talking about variations across states. And this is again something with Mr. Vittal would have known and would agree with our hope. We're talking about variations in states where per capita incomes range from 5 to 1. I mean, that's roughly the difference between, say, Tamil Nadu and the South, and say Bihar and Eastern UP. The politics of these two states have to be, certainly the politics of the richer states have to accept the need to bring in the sorts of modern technology and its consequences in order to make it possible to move faster. Now, if they do that, they will automatically become the more attractive states for investment. And this will be the signal to the weaker states that they need to follow, that it cannot be done by some planning commission allocating licenses and allocating resources. The center's ability to achieve these changes in states that don't follow is severely limited because of the fiscal constraints that I described. Now, the end result of all this is that states will actually grow at different rates. There will be migration, which is a good thing from an economic point of view. It will raise its own kind of problems. And fast-growing states, which are also demographically changing in the sense that population growth, etc., is slowing down, they will naturally need to attract more labor. This will have an implication on how politics works, complex thing to handle. So all said and done, I mean, the management of this transition poses a very different set of challenges from the ones that we faced at the time of the 1991 reforms. Quite frankly, Mr. Narasimha Rao and Mr. Manmohan Singh did the country a fantastic favor by actually breaking through those chains. And all they had to do, I think, was to persuade a bunch of bureaucrats who may have been taught in a different way, and they did that very successfully. And I think, as Subha pointed out, there was an enthusiasm in the bureaucracy that they were seeing changes made and they were actually participating in it. But today, it's not just the bureaucracy that's the constraint. It's a whole lot of other things. And our ability to overcome these constraints depend on how effectively does political leadership across the country, that also means individual states, how effectively does it actually translate, put in place the kind of governance and the kind of regulatory system that is supportive. Now, some of the regulatory system is entirely controlled at the central level. I mean, that certainly relates to things like trade policy. It relates to things like banking and financial sector. And that, I think, is correct. That's what should be capital markets. That's all done by the state. But on things like electricity, on things like how do you bring about the introduction of electric vehicles in municipal city transport, which is a very important. I mean, the present ICE vehicles are a very important cause of the pollution that most cities suffer from. To convert this to an EV is very important, electric vehicles. Now, in the start, you can have central subsidies, and that has been done. But probably the total number of EV buses in cities today doesn't exceed 10,000. Objective should be that in 10 years' time, in the top, let's say 20 cities in the country, which will be across different states, more than 50% of the bus fleet should be electric vehicles. That is not going to happen unless there's a transformation in how these issues are managed at the state level. And almost certainly, some states are going to outperform others. Now, I don't want to go on and on, but I want to give you one, I want to refer back to a very interesting occasion when I was speaking in Chennai. I think it was still, I don't know if it was called Chennai then or Madras, but Chennai. And I was talking about how the economic reforms had a differential effect on the states. And my argument, and I wrote a paper on this also, is yes, they did. I mean, during the reforms, the interstate inequality went up. But I felt that that was because it was the states that were more advanced, better placed, and to some extent had better infrastructure that were most able to benefit from the liberalization. But the answer was not that we should introduce licensing again to make sure that investment flows to the weaker states. The answer was that they needed to recognize, given their own constraints, what's the best way of making investment more attractive. And for example, labor laws. A state that has hardly any formal employment doesn't have a vested interest in having labor laws which are designed for a state that has a lot of formal employment and where labor and organized labor is strong. So you can have a situation where the state of labor laws is poor. I would say poor is less protective in states where there's too much labor and more protective in states where there is less labor. This again means allowing flexibility across states and not imposing any kind of central norm. At this lecture, when I was saying that, look, depending on whether states respond to the new environment, they can do well. One person from the audience got up and said, "Sir, I wonder whether you have thought that these policies will be very damaging for the backward states." And I was about to respond, but Mr. Murusuli Maran, who was there on the table, the dais, he said, "No, I want to say something." And at that point, he said, "There are no backward states in India. There are only mismanaged states." Now, that may have reflected a somewhat more self-confident view on what the reason for the difference was. But I think the important thing is the nature of the political constraint varies across states, and that will automatically affect the ability of the state to take advantage of changes. But in my view, if the states were to think hard about whether they are unnecessarily restricting their own ability to respond, I think that would be it would lead to greater flexibility in some of the areas that I've talked about, which don't actually require a national approach. So I'm not saying, by the way, I want to close with just one point, and that is that I think India's economy has many strengths, and the fact that we've got a whole bunch of younger people, more entrepreneurial, certainly than my generation, many of the sort of people that went through the kind of educational processes that I did in my generation wanted to join the government. In this present generation, they want to do things themselves. They want the flexibility to be imaginative, have new startups, and that area has worked quite well. Because of this, the right design of policy could make it possible for the 6.5% growth to go up to 8%. By the way, that's a huge task because an average of 8% for 22 years has to mean 9% for the first 10 and maybe slowing down to 7% in the next 10. So don't assume that the movement is a very small one. Certainly don't assume that just because last quarter growth rate was 8.2%, we're up at 8%. That's a very low. There are many reasons why that was high. I still go by the view that the underlying growth rate is about 6.5. And as you've read from the newspapers, we're soon going to have a new GDP series, and that'll give us a better idea of what the underlying growth rate really is. So it's possible to go from 6.5 to 8 if government policy is very, very good. We also have to recognize that while government has the ability to raise growth rates, bad policy can really hurt growth rates. And I think in a situation where the world is changing very rapidly, the impact of those bad policies can be very sudden. So I think governments need to be watchful that they don't take steps which actually end up lowering the growth potential. Because it's not as if 6.5 is automatically going to happen and all our energies must be concentrated on getting to 8. I think we have to recognize even to sustain 6.5, we need to avoid mistakes. And the biggest mistake would be that we lose sight of the importance of the fiscal deficit. Because frankly, if you're working in an integrated world and you're working in an environment where you're relying on more capital flows, you're relying on the private sector, you need to have flexibility for the private sector to invest abroad, foreign investors to invest in India. And unfortunately, one of the things that they look out for most is the fiscal deficit. And we are not, as I said, we have not done badly. But the problem is that those who believe that most of these problems can be solved by the government putting more money have to recognize that either they suggest ways of raising the money or cutting expenditure. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. And I think I think if we had more B.P.R. Vithals around in the different states, we would get a really good assessment of what these different challenges are. And I'm waiting for the Finance Commission report to be released. It's been submitted, and it would be a very important signal of what is their assessment of what these problems are. So with those words, let me close at this point and once again tender an unqualified apology for not being able to be there in present. And thank the organizers for thinking of me for this lecture. Thank you.
On behalf of all of us here in the audience, I want to thank Montek Singh Ahluwalia for a wonderful lecture. It covered a very wide canvas, covered a number of issues very comprehensively, very substantively. One final request I want to make, you suggested that CESS must organize a panel discussion after the Finance Commission report comes up. And I want to extract a promise from you that you will come for a panel discussion. On that understanding, I want to thank you for this lecture. Over to Professor Emily.
But we would also like to have another event seizing this opportunity. We would like to felicitate our former chairman, Professor K.L. Krishna, who was chairman of Center for Economic and Social Studies during 2007 to 2013 on his receiving Padma Shri Award earlier in this year. I request Professor K.L. Krishna to come over to the dais. So K.L. Krishna is awarded the prestigious Padma Shri for his exceptional contributions to education and literature earlier this year. Professor Krishna has worked extensively in the areas of applied econometrics, industrial economics, and regional economic analysis. He authored several research papers and mentored generations of scholars. Born on August 16, 1935, Professor K.L. Krishna earned his bachelor's in mathematics from Andhra University and an MSc in statistics from Kerala University. Trained under renowned statistician Professor C.R. Rao at the Indian Statistical Institute, he earned a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago as a Fulbright scholar. His doctoral thesis at the University of Chicago was titled Production Relations in Manufacturing Plants and Explored Production Function Estimation using data from selected manufacturing industries in the United States. He worked under the well-known econometrician Zvi Grilish, whose work was known in the areas of technological change and diffusion of innovations. He joined the Delhi School of Economics in 1958 and held several prominent academic and administrative roles, including Director of Delhi School of Economics, Chairman of Center for Economic and Social Studies, Hyderabad, and Madras Institute of Development Studies, Chennai. He also served as President of the Indian Econometric Society and was the founding editor of the Journal of Quantitative Economics. As the leader of the Indian CLEMS project at Delhi School of Economics from 2013 to 22, supported by the Reserve Bank of India, Professor K.L. Krishna contributed to developing a comprehensive industry-level database of the Indian economy, facilitating in-depth analysis of productivity across different sectors and enabling international comparisons. His legacy is one of academic excellence and compassionate mentorship, making a lasting impact on the field. He knew Indian databases like the back of his hand. Even after retiring in 2000, Professor K.L. Krishna continued teaching until 2010. His lifelong dedication to scholarship, education, and policy research has left a lasting imprint on India's economic thought, culminating in this national honor. CESS was fortunate to have him as its chairman and to receive his mentorship, especially for scholars working in the areas of industry and applied econometrics. The institute is privileged to inherit a rich legacy of eminent scholars such as Professor K.L. Krishna, Professor C.H. Hanumantarao, and Professor Radhakrishna. Their contributions continue to inspire us and future generations to emulate their scholarship and to advance the frontiers of knowledge with humility. Thank you. I now request Dr. Subbarao Garu to felicitate. I request Dr. Mahinda Reddy and to come over to the desk.
To express my deep sense of gratitude to Professor Revati and Dr. Subbarao for conferring this honor on me. I only would like to mention that my experience as chairman of CESS was very educative for me, and I owe that to one of the founders of CESS, Professor Hanumantarao. He really asked me to succeed him as the chairman of CESS. I was there for 6 years, and it was a great experience for me. Of course, later on, I went to MIDS as chairman, and I must also say that I am here. I'm in a way trying to continue some work. A few years ago, I prepared a report on productivity in India. I think that is a project funded by RBI. It is a very important study covering the entire economy in different sectors. Now, I think after that, I am working on urbanization. In that connection, I would like to mention Ahluwalia. I think the wife of Professor Montek Ahluwalia. Of course, I had worked with her for many years. In 2011, she completed a report on urban infrastructure and services. It was a Ministry of Urban Development request they did, and I'm continuing the study. It is in that connection I'm spending 3 or 4 days here in CESS as a guest of CESS. I am very grateful to CESS for this honor as well as the facilities I'm getting for completing this study. Urbanization is a very important aspect. I think it has been neglected in India, and because of the boundary of livelihoods and employment, urbanization is very important, and I'm happy I'm able to. I have given her a draft of my report, and also this is a part of a volume in honor of Professor C.H. Hanumantarao. I think being edited by Professor Revati and Mahendra Dev. I'm proud to say Mahendra Dev was my student in Delhi School in the MPhil in 1978 to 81. I think subsequently he did his PhD. So I'm mentioning all this briefly because CESS contribution through Mahendra Dev is very substantial. Of course, Hanumantarao is a great important. I'm glad to see one of my former students, Mahendra Reddy here. He has done excellent work in the field of education as Vice Chancellor of Equa University. I do not take more of your time. I'm happy to be here. Also, I'm very happy to see Sanjay here, Sanjay Baru and Mrs. Baru here. I think I have known him for a long time. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. It's my privilege to propose vote of thanks on behalf of Center for Economic Social Studies at the conclusion of this fourth B.P.R. Vithal Memorial Lecture. First and foremost, I extend our deep gratitude to Sri Montek Singh Ahluwalia ji, Distinguished Fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress and former Deputy Chairman of Planning Commission of India, for delivering an insightful and thought-provoking lecture on the challenges of policy making in a fast-changing world. He has taken all efforts to see the lecture is organized well with attention to detail to pay homage to Sri Vithal Garu in a befitting way. On behalf of Chairman, Board of Governors, I thank him profusely for making this event happen very successfully. His rich experience, analytical clarity, and forward-looking perspectives have truly enriched our understanding of the complexities of the policymaking in today's rapidly evolving environment. Thank you, sir, for agreeing to deliver the fourth B.P.R. Vithal Memorial Lecture. We are equally honored by the presence of Dr. Duvuri Subbarao Garu, former Governor of Reserve Bank of India, who graciously chaired today's session. Sir, your thoughtful observations and guiding remarks have added immense value to the proceedings. Thank you, sir, for accepting our request to chair the fourth B.P.R. Vithal Memorial Lecture. I thank Professor Hanumantarao Garu, Mahendra Reddy Garu, Professor Fatima Ali Khan, G.R. Reddy Garu, and Professor Srinivasulu Garu, and all other members of Board of Governors CESS for taking time to attend the lecture. We also extend our heartfelt thanks to Madam Sheshu Vithal Garu and Dr. Sanjay Baru Garu and other family members of Dr. B.P.R. Vithal Garu for gracing this memorial lecture with their presence. Your support and continued association with us add immense meaning to this important event at CESS. We are honored by the presence of several luminaries such as K.L. Krishna Garu, Jayaprakash Garu, DNR Garu, and Goel Garu, and several other esteemed members of academic and policy community. I thank each one of you individually for taking time to be with us and for enriching this occasion. I also take opportunity to thank all the officials from various departments, Government of Telangana, faculty members of CESS, scholars, and students from several institutions for joining us today and making this event meaningful by your presence and participation. Our gratitude to everyone who connected with us virtually. Thank you for being part of this program. A special word of appreciation goes to CESS team working under the leadership of Professor Revati, who worked behind the scenes to ensure the smooth conduct of this memorial lecture. Your dedication upholds the spirit of excellence we associate with the legacy of Sri B.P.R. Vithal Garu. I thank press both English and Telugu for making their presence and their coverage of the event. Finally, I thank one and all for being with us this morning. We look forward to your committed support and participation in future academic events of the center. Thank you.